Welcome to the discussion on perceptions and attribution. This is like the chapter 7 that you are continuing with. In the first half, the whole discussion of perceptions and attributions will be spread through 2 lectures. In the first, we will try to cover the definition of perception, the difference of perception from sensation, the mechanisms of perception and perceptual errors. And in the second lecture, we are going to cover the application of perception in organizations like social perception, impression management and attribution theory. So, in total the objectives of this chapter is to gain an understanding of perception, perceptual processes, perceptual selectivity and perceptual organization. And for the next chapter, the objectives are to gain understanding of social perception, attribution theory, some perceptual errors again and reduction of perceptual errors. Now, what is perception? If you can see from this information processing model of perception, so you can find on the left hand side there is a competing environmental stimuli which are coming from people or the events or objects present in the environment, and all these you find A, B, C, D, E, F, there are different stimuli coming from these environment. And then when you are talking of interpretation and categorization, this is where perception comes to play, where you give selective attention to some stimuli based on certain characteristics both present in the perceiver or in the environment or in the stimuli like the other people present or the events and the objects, and you make a give a selective attention and you select some of the stimuli and you do not select the other stimuli. Based on that, you do some interpretation and categorization of the stimuli and try to give meaning to those things. This part is called the perception. This part is mainly the perceptual part, and then this perception leads to memory, and lastly it leads to your judgment and decisions. So, you can find perception is a cognitive process where you are trying to interpret, give meaning to certain things based on certain mechanisms. So, we can see the definition of perception. It is a cognitive process. Cognitions are basically bits of information, and cognitive process involves the ways in which people process that information. And we have to understand that perception, the importance of perception lies in the fact that though the objective stimuli may be same, but perception is a very unique characteristics, in the sense it is very unique to the person who is making the interpretation. So, though objective reality may be same, but the subjective reality based on the interpretation of that objective reality differs from person to person, and it is an interpretation of the situation as the person observes it, loves to interpret it, and it is not the exact reality, the objective reality. So, as it is a subjective process, different people may interpret the same situation in different ways. The difference between perception and sensation is that sensation is a response of a physical sensory organ, whereas perception is much a broader concept and it is much complex in nature. So, when the stimuli first strikes the sense organ, it is only that portion is sensation. But how it is interpreted and the ultimate meaning that is given to that sensation is perception. So, although perception depends on the raw data, so but the cognitive processes involved in it may filter the data based on its own requirements and preferences and give a meaning which may be different from person to person, and which may completely change the data also based on the interpretation. So, here we will now discuss the mechanisms of perception, and which are called perceptual mechanisms, and we will come to discuss the different processes involved, like first step, second step, and how sensation may lead to perception. The first and foremost step in perception, the perceptual mechanism, is perceptual selection. So, what happens in perceptual selection is, like, we are confronted with many stimuli at a single point of time, but we are not responding to every stimuli that we receive, because it is not possible for us to process all the stimuli simultaneously. So, what we try to do, and the most relevant things are selected and given attention, and the others are not, other stimuli are not attended to. So, an individual selects certain stimuli based on certain factors. These factors may be present within the individual or maybe external to the individual. Now, when it is external to the individual, it could be external and related to the stimuli, or it can be external and related to the characteristics of the setting in which the stimuli is present. So, first we will try to see the factors which are external and related to the stimuli. So, these are consists of environmental influences and are in the form of characteristics of perceptual inputs or stimuli, and it may be due to certain characteristics of the stimuli which draws attention of the perceiver. First could be the size, example very big letters or small letters, intensity of the stimuli, a very large loud sound or a bright light, repetition and frequency, that is that you find in advertisements, which is done like they repeat the advertisements too often so that it get registered in your mind. Motion, like moving objects draws our attention most as compared to stationary objects, and like commercials in TV get more attention than print media. Then we move to like novelty and familiarity. While you are talking of these two things simultaneously, means new objects in a familiar setting or a familiar object in a new setting attracts your attention most. Then contrast effect, like stimuli that are in contrast with the situations, with the surrounding environment, are most likely to catch attention than the stimuli that is blended with the situation. So, color again is one of the factors, smells like aroma of the food or drink, and also sound, like impact of music. These are characteristics present within an object which draws attention for that object getting selected. When we are talking of internal and related to the perceiver, these are individuals' complex psychological makeup. So, people will select stimuli based on their own learning, their motivation and personality pattern. So, when you are talking of learning, learning creates an expectancy in the people, in the sense like they will try to hear and see, perceive certain things what they want to hear and see. So, previous learning creates an expectation, an expectancy to hear or feel certain things in certain way. So, what happens, sometimes we create our own world view. So, this is the way of seeing the world in certain ways based on our past learning and teaching that we have received from maybe our family members or elders, peers, etc. So, this creates a world view, in the sense it creates our own way of looking into things. So, that is how learning affects perception. Next is response disposition, which is the tendency to recognize familiar objects more quickly than unfamiliar ones. This recognition is based on our past learning and how it helps in recognizing things that we are seeing in present. Next is needs and motives, in which what happens, the present dominant need plays an important part in what stimuli we are recognizing at that particular point of time. So, if we are very hungry and we will try to find out food, and we can see only food and nothing else around. So, that is what the dominant need helps us to recognize or to focus on objects which are going to gratify that immediate need, and that is called response salience, means a tendency to focus on objects that relate to our immediate needs or wants. Next comes personality, where personality, values and even age affect the way people perceive the world around them. So, here where we are talking of, when we are talking of personality, if we remember, we have already discussed about some dispositional like affective patterns, like positive affectivity and negative affectivity, and this affectivity, like your positive affectivity or negative affectivity, colors the way people interpret objects around them. This is the general tendency to see the world either through a positive lens or through a negative lens, and people differ in their ways of interpreting things based on these affectivities. Now, when we are discussing point 3, which is characteristics of the setting itself, like where the whole perception is taking place. So, it is influenced by the physical context of the setting, the social context and the organizational context. So, what happens over here is, like if you are seeing like factors in the situation, when you are seeing that person, suppose the way you see a person in a very formal setting and you see the same person in an informal setting, per perception of that some similar person may vary, because it is the situation which helps you to perceive that person in a different light. So, whether you see that person in the working setting, whether you see that person in a social setting, all that, at what time of the day you see that person in the morning, you see it in the day or at the evening time, all these factors may play a role in determining what qualities of that person you are able to see, and as a result it will affect your perception about a particular person or objects. So, in a nutshell, if you can see like what are the factors affecting perception, is factors present in the situation, that is time, work setting or social setting, factors in the perceiver like attitudes, motives, interest, expectations and experience, and factors present in the target, the novelty, motion, sound, size, background, proximity, similarity, all these will affect your perception. Means these are the factors which affects the perceptual selection. Next, we move to the discussion on perceptual organization. Here what happens, it is not enough to select a particular stimuli, because there are again, even after you select the stimuli based on the factors present either within the perceiver or the situation or the perceived objects or the person, then still it is a very disconnected information that you get, and in order to give meaning to those information, the data rather, it to like put it to to make it valuable information which you can get from that stimuli or that data, it has to be organized in certain senses. That is the next area of our discussion, which is called perceptual organization. So, after that information has been selected in order to get an extract meaning from that what is perceived by the individual. So, what happens, it moves through a process of perceptual organizing, which is a more of a cognitive process. So, the principle underlying that process is called the Gestalt principle, based on the school of psychology which was developed, it called the Gestalt psychology, and which means like pattern or configuration. So, the factors which influence it are the stimulus factors, again which are like physical or other observable characteristics of the person, object or situation perceived, which are same as what we discussed earlier. Individual response factors are again like interest, needs, motivation, involvement, learning, attitudes, personality, and certain principles of perceptual organization, which are like figure and ground, closure, grouping and simplification. What is figure and ground is stimuli that contrast with their environment are more likely to be noticed. The perceived object's event and person stands out, distinct or separable from its background, and gives the cognitive attention. So, if we are suppose now you see like this is a blank paper. Now, when I put this black dot over here, what happens? It immediately gets your attention. Why? Because this background now acts as a ground, and this gets your attention as the figure. This is called the figure ground phenomena, where the figure is in sharp contrast with the background present. Now, in organizational situation, if somebody is like in the team, if somebody is like over enthusiastic, energetic, and like responds well to situation, is proactively does certain things, these are the factors which selects that person for perception, for getting attention from others, as compared to the other team members. So this is called the figure ground relationships. So next is the closure phenomena. In closure, what happens, like it is a general tendency of people to give meaning to incomplete things. When we are exposed to incomplete phenomena, what we try to do is to give a completeness to that based on our own learning, our past experience, our motivation, our personality pattern, and all these things. If you can see over here, this figure, if you notice it carefully, is not a circle, but because there is a gap over here. You notice this point, there is a gap over here. This is an incomplete figure, but we try to see it as we love to see it as a circle, because that that relieves us of the tension of incompleteness, and we can give a complete meaning to things, and we try to fill in the missing pieces based on our own backgrounds or information, past information available, and all these things. In organizations, this may lead to sometimes like grapevine, when we do not having or spreading of stories, because while we do not have a complete information about certain things, what sometimes generates is rumors in the organization, because everybody, to get out of the tension of incompleteness, will try to give meaning to the things based on their own like backgrounds and own preferences. Grouping: continuity, proximity, and similarity in groups of stimuli. So when a group of stimuli are presented to people, what they try to do, they try to group it together based on certain phenomena which are present. These are called continuity, proximity, and similarity. The continuity principle says people will try to perceive continuous lines or patterns. So the people will tend to perceive the sensory data in a continuous pattern, even if they are not actually continuous. So if you see, this is as a continuity principle, we love to see it as a straight line, because we try to fill in the, like we try to cover up the gaps as seen in closure, and we love to see it as one straight line, which is the continuity principle, and we will try to see continuous lines. Proximity: when two stimuli are very close to each other, people will try to see it in as related to each other. So you can observe the proximity principle from here. So, as these two lines are close to each other, we try to group it together, and as these two are again close to each other, we try to group it together. This is the principle of proximity, the nearness in space. Like the more one stimuli is closely related, closely placed with the other stimuli, it helps us to like tell like they are trying to form a group. Similar for individuals in the organization, if, while we can see informal groups bondings taking place because of the nearness of like the space that they are sitting, or mentally their people are close to each other because they share some common things, then that leads to group formation or bonding. Next is like when you're talking of similarity, so things which are alike, when stimuli are alike in some way, people tend to group it together. Suppose what we do over here in the same thing, you see based on the similarity principle, now these two appears to be same and these two appears to be same. This is called the similarity principle. Things which tend like looks alike are similar based on certain characteristics, they tend to group together. Next is simplification. Like while people are trying to create meaning, and if there are too many stimuli present at that point of time, so what people does is make a simple meaning of things instead of very complicated ones, and what this is the process of subtraction goes on, where people subtracts less salient information and concentrates on more important ones. Next, after this organization process, the third step which is important, which is called perceptual interpretation. So, there are three steps in the perceptual mechanism. First is perceptual selection, when you select the stimuli based on certain factors. Next is perceptual organization, where you organize those stimuli based again on certain factors and principles of organization. And after that is perceptual interpretation, where you now try to give meaning to that organized stimuli. Now what happens, this perceptual interpretation is again affected by certain factors, and these could be like characteristics of the stimuli again, situation under which the perception takes place, and of course the characteristics of the perceiver. And it may happen that due to misinterpretation of either factors in the stimuli or in the environment, or some special like moods depending on certain days, like your moods and emotions present with, like as a factor of the perceiver, misinterpretations may occur, and the perceiver may commit a mistake in giving meaning to certain situations, and these are called perceptual errors and distortions. So, what happens, we will try to now discuss what are these errors and how these occurs at different points. So, some errors occurring at selection stage is due to the selective exposure. What we do is we selectively perceive certain things because of our selective exposure to the stimuli. So, it is a general tendency for people to seek out stimuli which are pleasant in nature and towards which people are sympathetic, and to avoid stimuli which are threatening in nature or painful in nature. So, what happens, the stimuli which are based on our current needs, stimuli that what people can anticipate, and stimuli whose change level is high, means intensity and frequency is high, and those things get selected based on, like, we love to select a pleasant stimuli. So, next is perceptual defense. What we do is we screen out stimuli which we find are psychologically threatening to us, even though we are already exposed to such situations, and even though that it has taken place, what we do is sometimes we screen that out subconsciously from our mind, because that is threatening to us. And then what happens, we give selective attention to certain things and to those elements which are more attracting towards, psychologically more attracting to us, to our needs and interests, and we do not select other things. Perceptual blocking is where we block certain stimuli from reaching our mind by simply tuning it off. Selective distortion is where we try to distort certain meaning of things so that it appears in a favorable meaning to us. So, people try to interpret facts that will be consonant rather than in dissonant with their perceptions. So, this happens, like while we are talking of stereotypes in the organization. Even if we meet a person who is not fitting into the category that of the preconceived notion that we are having about a particular person, what we try to do, we try to distort certain information about that person. We try to selectively attend to certain things and perceptually block certain information, so that the person fits in the preconceived idea, schemata, or the stereotype that we have about that particular group of people. So, this is called selective distortion. Selective retention is people tend to retain information that supports their attitudes and beliefs, and we forget or we do not remember those things which are not supporting our beliefs. So, if we have framed certain idea of about certain people, or we have formed certain, like we want to prove like this person is like this. So, these are more relevant while I am talking of, why I am talking of person, because in organizations person perception is a very important thing. So, if we have already framed a belief about certain person, this person is of this nature, then what we try to do, even if we get different information, different sets of information about that particular person, some information which may disprove what we are believing, what we are like proposing about the person's nature, what we try to do is we ignore those information and selectively retain only that part of the information which is going to support the idea that we have framed about that particular person. All these things, if you can understand, will lead to the error in misinterpreting the nature of that particular person of whom we are concerned about. So, this you can see is the basic elements in perceptual process. Again, in a brief, like environmental stimuli, you observe it based on taste, smell, hearing and touch. This process is called sensation. You select it over here, which is the perceptual selection based on certain external factors which is present in the stimuli, and internal factors like personality, learning and motivation, which is internal to the individual, which gets organized based on the perceptual grouping principles, and then you try to interpret it. Is based on perceptual errors occurring like perceptual defense, stereotyping, halo effect, projection, expectancy effects, and again lead to attribution based on internal versus external causes, causes of success and failures, and response, and ultimately we respond to that individual, which could be covert in the sense attitudes, motivations and feelings, and overt is again your behavior. This attitude, motivation and feelings may again affect your perception. So, next we will continue after this discussion. We are continuing with some of the errors like which are occurring, and like the distorting influences and the physical appearances. This slide like was in a nutshell like what is the process that is there, like which can help you to see in together what is the process of perception. We will continue with the errors like stereotype, where it is the tendency of the perceiver to perceive another person, which you have told already, based on the certain characteristics of the group which he belongs to. So, again irrelevant cues is sometimes while we are to make a difficult judgment about which is a very complex judgment, then what we try to do, sometimes we give importance to irrelevant cues and like irrelevant stimuli. So, this often you can observe like when people are trying to criticize or they are critical about certain things in the organization or about a certain person, maybe, or when there is a conflict, you find people are talking more about not the issue at hand which they are to debate about, but sometimes some past incidents, past interactions are given more importance in the discussion, and people lose track about what they originally meant to discuss. So, these are called irrelevant cues and importance given to that when you are discussing something very like complex and about which you have to form a judgment about perceptual judgment. Next is like first impression. This is another errors which occurs in perception, like people try to judge others based on their first impression, which may not be a true reflection of the person who is perceived. Jumping to conclusion, people in hurry try to jump steps of like the whole thought process, and they try to jump to conclusions, and this could be leading to problems while decision making. So this is where perception plays an important role in decision making. Sometimes we, based on our past experience, we hurriedly try to conclude about certain things without drawing, like looking into the details of the information and the cues received from the environment or the stimuli in the present context. So based on our past experiences, we try to jump into conclusions or arrive at a very quick solution which could be erroneous in nature. Inference is where people have to judge others on limited information. When we are talking of halo effect, what happens under this halo effect? A person or a product or a situation is perceived on the basis of only a single trait. So whatever the single trait it may be, it may override all other traits in the formation of that perception. So here what we do, like we try to judge a person based on a single characteristics, and all other factors we overlook. We give a positive meaning to all other things which could be negative in nature also, and this may like play a very important part while we are like about to select someone in the interview process or in the process of performance appraisal. What happens, our performance feedback, like if we like certain characteristics of certain person which may be related or may not be related to the issue at hand, like whether that person has performed well or not, or whether that person is a fit for the organization or not. So these maybe if the person is pleasant looking or well mannered and something like has a good way of communicating, like attractive communication, all these may overshadow the other relevant aspects, and like a person with these characteristics but maybe less in other relevant traits required for that particular job or situation, compared to a person who is not very high in this communication or not maybe having a pleasant look or something, this person may get an advantage because this creates a halo effect, and it like overshadows all other things and as compared to the other person. So this could sometimes lead to misinterpretation and like misjudgment also on the part of the interviewers or the appraisers. Next, which is called a reverse halo effect. In reverse halo effect, what happens, it is the opposite, which is called the horn effect also, like where due to some factor which is maybe only one factor which could be negative in nature, so all other positive factors are negated. All other positive factors of the employees are negated because of only one negative factor, which again overshadows all other positives in that person. So this is called again reverse halo effect, and actually halo effect plays, or the reverse halo effect plays a major role in some important decisions of performance appraisal and selection processes in the organization. Next we come to perceptual set, which is like the previously held beliefs about objects influence a individual's perception of similar objects. So, subsequent perception will be influenced by this set. So, what happens if we have, as we were discussing in stereotype, if I have a preconceived notion about certain object or certain things or a group of objects or a group of people, then what we do is this preconceived perceptual set, it affects the subsequent perception of similar objects by the perceiver. We have to understand similar objects means objects which are like the previous objects in certain senses, but they are not the same. But and there is individuality present in these objects or persons also. But while we are perceiving a new object based on this perceptual set, what we do is, based on the perceptual set, we go on interacting with that object or that person in based on this previous learning, and we try to see these new things, these similar things in the same light as the earlier objects. This is called like how preconceived, previously held beliefs about objects, they influence individuals' perception of similar objects, and we fail to see the novelty in the new objects or persons that we have met, and sometimes our interactions like suffers due to this, because we try to put everyone in the same thing. We try to put everyone like as if they are all same sort of, and we do not understand the uniqueness of the new person or object, which could be sometimes erroneous in our person. It may lead to, it may help in certain extent, like if you are meeting someone for the first time, initially it can help you to start the interaction, but if you are continuing with it, then means you are failing to discover the unique characteristics of that particular object or person and how it can help your organization. So, at that part it may lead to some erroneous effects. Projection. So, it is again assigning one's own thoughts and feelings to the person being perceived. So, you are projecting your own beliefs on that person. Attribution is using observations and inferences to explain a person's behavior. This we will discuss in details in the next chapter, in the next lecture, like how attribution takes place and how it may lead to certain errors of perception. Contrast effect. In contrast effect, what happens? We perceive something as larger or bigger or more pleasant than other things, than that thing actually is, based on the surroundings, based on other people present around, and that may be again erroneous perception. Like the length of this line, when it is present singly, you can understand what length it is of, but when it is present with someone who is this much, then what happens? It appears shorter, and when it is present with someone who is this much, then it appears to be longer. So what happens? So this due to this contrast effect, what we try to see a person is either larger than or smaller than the person actually is, based on other phenomena present around. From the reference point that is used to, if I compare this with this, then it appears to be smaller, but if I compare this with this, it appears to be much larger. So this reference point is very important. Assimilation effect is a judgments a person has made in the past influence the way person will perceive the stimuli in the future, and it takes place as a combination of like priming and like asking people to recall a set of events before asking them to make judgment that may be related to those events, like please try to remember about certain facts and then try to say how you liked or like disliked that situation. And your confirmation bias, like the tendency to give heavy weightage to information that reaffirms past judgments and discount information that would contradict past judgments. So this will lead to like assimilation effect, like even when we are talking of like situations while we are trying to like emphasis on our viewpoints, we try to assimilate facts, like we try to refer to past experience and we play down on information which is not like assimilating with the past information. But in that case we may lose major information, because something which is not in assimilation with the older ones may be the storehouse of a new knowledge, like new concepts, but sometimes we try to ignore that in order to say like we are in tune with the available source of knowledge. Distortion management, what managers can do. So managers should balance automatic and controlled information processing at the attention and selection stage, broaden their schemas at the organizing stage, and be attuned to attribution at the interpretation stage. So if you broaden your schemas, then what happens, it will lead to less of like errors due to perceptual set, and like you can focus on the novelty and negative effects of assimilation. All these things will not be there, because when your schema is large, you can understand like how to organize things under these different schemas, and you can draw your correct interpretation. So, and how to make attribution, like whether whether the characteristics of happenings, events is due to the nature of the person or certain characteristics of the individual, which attribution really speaks of, like we should be attuned to the attribution of the objects and processes at the interpretation stage. This will help to reduce the distortions. So we will continue with the next session where it talks of social perception, attribution theory, and errors related to attribution, and how it can again be helpful for performance of the better interpretation of the organizational situations, how we perceive it, how we make major decisions and in the organization, and how it lead to better performance. Thank you.